Kesubos Daf Kuf Ala finishes off the 11th parak of the Masechta, parak Almana Nizonos, and begins the 12th. We're discussing our last Mishnah, where we had seen three types of women who lose their ksuba. That is a mimma enes, a ketana who does mian, a shnia, that is a forbidden marriage midrabanan, and an islandess, they all lose their ksuba. The Gemara is going to discuss a number of phrases in the Mishnah and explain them. Then we'll get to our next parak, which begins with a Mishnah discussing what happens when a man marries a woman and promises to support her daughter from a previous marriage. So let's begin. We have seen that there is a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel whether a ketana's marriage is worth anything halachically. Are there any rights that the ketana has? This is talking about without mian. When there's mian, certainly the marriage was never existent. It is uprooted in the first place. Here, the question, though, is while she's married, and again, this is a marriage only midrabanan, she's not married off by her father, she's married by her mothers or by her brothers, it's a derabanan marriage. Is there any validity to that marriage? Does that give them rights? So it's seen in machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says it does not give her any rights, and Shmuel says no, she has the rights to the ksuba and all the other rights that a wife has, as long as she's married and she doesn't do mian. So Gemara wants to say this should be dependent on a machlokes tanaim. We've seen a machlokes tanaim between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua as to the marriage of a ketana before she does mian, whether the husband has any rights. So the Gemara quotes the machlokes. Rabbi Elazar says that the marriage of a ketana is not worth anything, and her husband does not have the right to her found objects or to her earnings or to be made for her nidarim. And when she dies, he does not inherit her, and he is not mitame to her. The rule is he ends off, she's not considered his wife in any way. It's only a derabanan arrangement, and there are no rights that he has from her at all. So the Gemara wants to say, so that sounds like it fits perfectly in Rav's shita, who says that she has no rights from him either. Now, the Tana that argues is Rabbi Yeshua, and he says he has all those rights. There is a marriage, so that fits perfectly with Shmuel, who says that she has the rights to ksuba as well. So the Gemara says no, this is not actually fully dependent. This machlokes amirayim on a machlokes tanaim. Shmuel will definitely have to learn that there is a machlokes tanaim that does not fit with him. He cannot fit in Rabbi Eliezer, and that's because it's much more likely that the husband has rights of in a marriage to a ketana than that the ketana does. The reason that the marriage was made midrabanan is to help her, because if she's not married and she doesn't have a father, she's hefker and she could get into trouble. Therefore, we want her to get married. It's for her benefit, and we want to encourage men to enter such a marriage, and therefore we'll give him the rights. So it's much more logical that he should have rights and that she should have rights. So therefore, Rabbi Elazar, who says that he doesn't have any rights, would certainly say she has no rights. Now Shmuel disagrees, and Shmuel says she has rights. Obviously, then Shmuel is going like Rabbi Yeshua. However, Rav could fit into both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Rav fits perfectly with Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the husband has no rights. Rav also holds that the wife has no rights. However, Rav could say that Rabbi Yeshua will agree with me. Rabbi Yeshua says that the husband has rights. That's again because Chazal wanted the husband to have rights because it's for the benefit. The whole marriage is for the benefit of the wife, and therefore we give extra rights to the husband. However, Rabbi Yeshua would agree with me, says Rav, that she does not have any rights. It's enough of a schus for her that she has the marriage, and we want to encourage the husband to enter the arrangement. All right, now the Gemara goes on to the next line in the Mishnah, where we had seen that a mimma enes and a shnia, that's a iser derabanan marriage, and an islandess, they're all listed that they lose their ksuba, and they lose the fruits of their field, and they lose mazonos, and then it said below, so they lose worn out clothing. So the Gemara is going to ask who this is referring to. We're going to go through all the options, but first of all, to define blows is objects that the woman brought into the marriage that are returned to her at the end of the marriage. They're hers, and they return to her at the end of the marriage. Worn out clothing is just an example of one of the things that she brings into the marriage. Now, there are two types of things which a woman brings into the marriage as to how they're categorized throughout the marriage. There's nechse malug and nechse son barzel. Nechse malug remain her possession, and the husband has a right to use them as long as he doesn't destroy them. He has a right to use them throughout the marriage, and then they're still hers. When the marriage dissolves by divorce or any other way, she takes them and she goes in whatever state they're in. Now, nechse tzon barzel are different. Nechse tzon barzel she brings into the marriage. They are evaluated at the beginning of the marriage, and the value is written into the ksuba, and this is the amount that she gets back when the marriage is over. The husband takes possession of it throughout the marriage, and he has to pay for it when the marriage ends. So when we said that these three women in the Mishnah lose their bloss, that means that they are losing the rights to their property. So the Gemara's question is, why should they lose the right to their property, and what are we talking about over here? Gemara quotes Rav Huna Barachia, who said, Rav Kahana, you told us in the name of Shmuel that this is true for Nichsei Melug and not for Nichsei Tzon Barzel. She only loses her property. She does not get to take with her own property, but that which was owed to her, that the husband took responsibility to pay her, that she will get to keep. That is going to be returned to her at the end of the marriage, even in this Mishnah here of Mima'enes, Shnia, and an Eilis. Wasn't talking about Nichsei Melug. It was not talking about Nichsei Tzon Barzel. It was only talking about Nichsei Melug. So Gemara says, which of the three cases are we referring to? So let's work through them. So Gemara says that Rav Papa asked, how does this make sense? So if we're referring to a Mima'enes, that's a Ketana who entered the marriage midrabanan, and she has a right to leave it at any time. Now the reason she loses anything is because she exited the marriage. She's the one who ended, so she loses her rights. They get Ksuba and all the other things that come when she's sent away. Because she's not being sent away, she's leaving. So Gemara asks, it doesn't make sense that she should lose her property just because she's ending the marriage. If it's her property, why should she lose it? So the Gemara says we have to go through two possibilities here. So again, we have to work through all three women, the Mima'enes, the Shni, and the Eilenis, whether we're talking about Nichsei Melug or Tzon Barzel, and the following two options as well. Are these properties still around that she could take them and go, or are they gone? Were they destroyed and they have to be paid back to her? Now, Nichsei Tzon Barzel, it doesn't matter if they're here or not. The husband took possession of it anyway, and he has to pay her for them. Nichsei Melug is a little different. There, she was supposed to maintain ownership of it, and the husband was just supposed to use it. If they got used up and they got destroyed, the husband does have to replace it if he didn't have the right to use it. So let's go through them. So if we're referring to that they're still here, they're still around, so then she should take them and go. What's the problem? They're her property. Why should she lose her property just because she's mamayin? If we're talking about where they're gone and she has to be paid for them, here it's a little more complicated. Here Rav Papa says if it's a mima'enes, she should not get paid for either of them. Now, Nichsei Tzon Barzel, the husband should be able to say, hey, I accepted upon myself to pay for these objects. I took possession of them illegally, and I was going to pay for them when I divorced her. I'm not divorcing her. She's walking out on her own. She loses her rights to get paid for them. And I had legal right to use them because this was a full legal marriage, although it's midrabanan, I had the right to use them, and now she walked out, so she loses her rights. Now, Nichsei Melug is a little more complicated why the husband should not have to pay her for them. They were her property. He didn't have a right to use them. There's a discussion amongst the Rishonim why that should be. The Ritva gives a simple explanation, and he says it's a knas. We don't want her to walk out of the marriage. We want it to be hard for her to walk out of the marriage, and therefore we tell her you're not going to get your Nichsei Melug if you leave. So the Gemara says, therefore, when Rav Kahana said that she does not get her Nichsei Tzon, she does not get her Nichsei Melug, but she does get her Nichsei Tzon Barzel, could not have been referring to a Mima'enes, because if they're still in existence, she should get them for both types of nechasim, and if they're not still in existence, she should not get them for either type of nechasim. So the Gemara says, okay, let's go to the next option. What about an eilenis? Now, in eilenis, the marriage is a mekach tais. It's voided because the husband did not know what she was. So now the Gemara says as follows. If the objects are still in existence, she should get them, just like we said before. The marriage is voided, but they're her possessions, her property. She may lose her ksuba because it was not a valid marriage, but she's no reason she should lose her own property again. Now, if they don't exist, then it should be the opposite. Nichsei Melug are her property. Why should she not have them restored to her? They're hers. Now, as far as Nichsei Tzon Barzel, there, again, the ruling of Rav Kahana seems to be wrong. She should not get paid for them. And the reason is because the husband had a right to use them, and even if he used them up and they got destroyed, so we're going to see soon, that's part of the usage of it, and he shouldn't have to pay for it if the marriage turns out to be false. He never accepted that obligation. He had legal right to use it when he used it. And the fact that it got destroyed is not his fault as long as he was using it legally, and he doesn't have to return it because he should have no obligation. His marriage was canceled because she was an eyeless. Therefore, the Gemara goes to its third pshat. The Gemara says it's referring to a shnias la'arayis, an iser derabanan marriage. And there, the Rabbanan made a knas. And they said that he's going to lose his rights and she's going to lose her rights. And therefore, logically, you should have been right. Her nechse malug, she should have been able to keep because it's hers. So the Rabbanan took it away from her and said she's not going to get it. That's why the Mishnah rules, and Rav Kahana explains, she doesn't get nechse malug. Now, as far as nechse tzom barzel, the husband should have the right to keep the money, should not have to pay for it. But there, we canceled his right as well. And we said you don't have the right for it. It's a knas because you entered a forbidden marriage, and he does have to pay for it. And that's why it's the inverse of what you would have otherwise said had it not been an usher marriage. Now the Gemara wants to derive a halacha based on what Rav Kahana said. So the Gemara said what you could see from here is that clothing, the use of a clothing is that it gets worn and it gets worn out. The question is that called the clothing itself, or is that called the usage of the clothing? If somebody's wearing clothing, is that called that he's taking ownership of the clothing itself, or is that just called he's getting the profits from the clothing themselves? Now the question is, because he's really just using them, but they do get worn out, they get rubbed out, and then eventually they're going to fall apart to some extent. So how do you view that? So we see from Rav Kahana's psak that a regular woman has a right to get back her clothing as nechse malug. That means that the husband doesn't have a right to use them and wear them out. Wearing them out is not called the payros, it's not called the profits of the clothing, it's the clothing itself which is being destroyed, and he doesn't have a right to destroy them. Therefore, what should he do? He should sell the clothing, buy land with it. The land belongs to the woman because it's hers, and he could just use the fruits that grow, that's the profits of it. So we're asking, Rav Nachman disagrees. Rav Nachman says the wearing of the clothing is the payros of the clothing, and they return to her however they are in whatever state they are. So we're saying Rav Nachman disagrees and argues on Rav Kahana. All right, now the Gemara goes on to the next line in the Mishnah, where we had said that ein lehen ksuba, these three women, mema'enes, hashem, and ailis, don't get a ksuba. So it says Shmuel, whenever the Mishnah says ein lehen ksuba, it means that they don't get the basics and minimum of the ksuba, the 100 zuz for the almana and the 200 zuz for the besua. But anything extra which is promised in the ksuba, that they do have a right to get. We learned a Bryce that says this as well. Anytime Chazal say ein lahem ksuba, they lose the basics, but they do get the extras. And the reason they get the extras is because that is a gift that is given to her because of chibas bia, because of the love that's involved. Therefore, even if the marriage is canceled under circumstances that she loses her rights, she still gets the gift. It's not a gift that she loses. On the other hand, if the language is Yotzos below ksuba, she gets sent away without a ksuba, but there she performed a crime so egregious that she loses her ksuba, like she's mizana or something. So in a situation like that, she won't even get the excess. She'll lose everything, and she'll certainly lose the mana Messiah. Now, if she gets sent away because of a shame ra, because she has a bad reputation, something that happened, then she takes whatever property she has that still exists, and she goes. She doesn't get anything that's written in the ksuba besides for whatever a property she brought in. Now, says the Gemara, this is a proof to the opinion of Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said that if she is mizana, she does not lose her worn out clothing, she doesn't lose the property she brought into the marriage, as long as they are still around. Whatever is there, she takes and goes. To get paid for them, that she's not going to get. So Gemara says that a teacher of Brisa said this over to Rav Nachman. If she's mizana, she loses. He said the opposite. He said she loses her clothing. Even the ones that still exist, she doesn't get the right to take them with her. So he said, if she was mizana, why should she lose? Why were her clothing mizana? She did something wrong. Doesn't mean her clothing did anything wrong. Meaning to say, she doesn't lose her property. What still belongs to her belongs to her. She doesn't have a right to get paid for anything. She loses her rights to collect, but her property is still hers. And therefore he was disagreeing. The Gemara says Rabbi Bar Chanas and Rav Yochanan, he explained that he didn't like this psak because he said this Brisa is the opinion of Rabbi Menachem Stim Tar, Rabbi Menachem, the writer of unnamed Mishnayos, or unnamed Brisos, but the Chachamim disagree, and they say that even if she's mizana, she does not lose her worn out clothing that still exists, and that is how he wanted to pass on Alachal Maisa, and therefore he protested to this psak. We now refer back to the Mishnah where we had mentioned the case of an almana marrying a kohen gadol, which is an iser d'oraisa, but it's only a lav. So the Gemara is going to discuss what happens if the kohen gadol knew that she was an almana, and he knowingly entered that situation, does that mean that she is going to get her ksuba, or does that affect whether she gets her ksuba or not? So the Gemara begins as follows. The Gemara says Rav Huna and Rav Yehud have a machlokas. They both agree that in an islandess, it makes a difference if he knew or if he didn't know. The Mishnah says so straight out. If he didn't know she was an islandess and turns out she's an islandess, she doesn't get a ksuba. If he knew she was an islandess and he married her knowingly, then she gets her ksuba. The question is, what happens if a Kohen Gadol marries an almana and he knew or he didn't know? Does that make a difference or not? So our Mishnah had said that a Kohen Gadol who marries an almana, she gets her ksuba. So Rav Huna said that is referring to where he knew she was an almana or he did not know she was an almana. Either way, she gets her ksuba. Rav Yehuda said no, that's only referring to where he knew she was an almana and he knowingly married her, just like an islandess. Had he not known she was an almana, he was fooled, then she would lose her ksuba as well. So Gemara is going to bring a proof on this machlokas from a brisa. So the brisa says if he married her on the assumption that she was an almana and it turns out that she was an almana, she gets her ksuba. Says the Gemara, the implication is that had he not known that she was an almana, she would lose her ksuba, just like Rav Huna said. Somebody says Rav Huna will defend and say no, that's not the implication. The implication is that had he known, had he been clearly told that she was not an almana, and it turns out she was, there she loses her ksuba. But if he had no indication, he wasn't told either way, there she would not lose her ksuba. So Gemara says, well, if that's true, so why does it talk about the case where he clearly didn't know to say that she loses her ksuba? I should just talk about the case where it was a stam. He wasn't told either way. That would be the simple case. So obviously it's not correct what you're saying, and in the case of the stam, she will lose her ksuba. Says the Gemara, there's another brisa that proves this as well. It says straight out, it says if he married her with the understanding that she was an almana, and she actually was an almana, she gets a ksuba. But if he married her with no information, not knowing whether she was an almana or not, the assumption is that she's not, and she's going to lose her ksuba. So that is a clear brisa against Rav Huna, as well as the kasha we had before. It says the Gemara, Rav Huna misunderstood our Mishnah. Our Mishnah quoted the difference between whether he knew or he didn't know about an islandess, so he felt, Rav Huna felt, it says it only about an islandess. It does not say that about an almana, which is listed next. Obviously, it's not true an almana. However, that was a mistake because the Mishnah is split between whether he knows or he doesn't know. It was meant to apply to both an islandess and an almana. Okay, this concludes the 11th parak. We now begin the 12th parak, which discusses what happens when a man marries a woman who has a child from a previous marriage. If she has a daughter, she can ask her husband to promise to support the child for a minimum number of years. So our Mishnah discusses where he says, and he writes for her, I am going to support this girl for 5 years. He gives a specific number, 5 years, and he does not say only as long as we're married. Therefore, what has happened is that he created an obligation. He created a chov. He's now a chov. He owes money to the daughter for 5 years worth of support. And that can't be canceled by anything that happens. So the Mishnah specifies, and it says somebody who marries a woman and they agree that he's going to support the daughter for 5 years, he is obligated to pay her for 5 years. If he divorces the wife, the girl's mother, and she marries someone else, she can go ahead and make the same deal with the next guy. He has to support her for 5 years. Now you have two men who are obligated to support the girl for 5 years, and they have an overlap. Let's say he divorced her after 1 year and she remarried. So there's 4 years that he still has left on his contract. He has to support her. Now the new husband has to support her for 4 years. So he has to give her support for all those 4 years. He cannot say, I'm only going to support her when she lives in my house, or I'm only going to support her when she comes to me. Wherever she is, she's with her mother. He has to send food to her mother's house. He also cannot meet with the second husband and make a deal with him that I'll give half and you'll give half. No, the girl gets twice support, and one of them gives food and the other one just gives money, the value of food that she should be receiving. Now, what happens if the girl grows up and she gets married herself within this time? Now her husband has an obligation to support her. So again, there's a dual obligation. Her mother's husband has an obligation to support her until the end of his 5 years, and the girl's own husband has an obligation to support her. And again, neither of them are canceled. They both have to support her. One gives money and one gives food. It could also be that she gets married while she has 2 stepfathers that are supporting her, and now she'll have 3 men supporting her, and each one will have to give a full amount. The reason for this, of course, is because a chov was created, and you cannot cancel the chov. The chov is not limited in any way. Now, if he would be smart, says the Mishnah, he writes in the original agreement, I'm going to support her as long as you're with me, as long as she's with me, or as long as you're with me. And once you get divorced and you go, this obligation ends. So put a limiting factor in there. All right, now the Gemara wants to discuss a different machlokas amarim, which will bring us back to our Mishnah and what the chiddush of our Mishnah is. If he wrote out that he has to support her, what exactly is the chiddush? So the Gemara goes to a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, where somebody admits to his friend in front of witnesses, I owe you money. He says, I owe you 100 zuz. So Rabbi Yochanan says he's chayav to pay it. Rish Lakish says he's not chayav to pay it. So the Gemara says, well, what's the case of here? We know in the Gemara in Sanhedrin that if somebody says in front of witnesses, I owe you 100 zuz, it only creates an obligation if he says to the witnesses, you are being my witnesses now that I owe you 100, that about what I'm about to say. You're going to testify to this. If he doesn't appoint actual witnesses, it doesn't count. He doesn't owe anything. So what's the case here? Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. If there are witnesses, and he appointed them as witnesses, then there should be an obligation. Everyone should agree. And if there's no witnesses, there should not be an obligation. So what's going on? So says the Gemara, it must be referring to where he wrote a shtar and he didn't sign it. And there were witnesses who saw that he wrote the shtar and that he gave it. So you have kind of a middle ground here. He didn't appoint them as witnesses, but he did write the shtar and he didn't sign the shtar. So there you have a machlokas, does that count as an official declaration that creates the chov or not? So the Gemara wants to say that this is also the case of our Mishnah, because otherwise, what's the chiddush in our Mishnah? If he wrote a document for the woman, he wrote into her ksuba, I'm going to support your daughter for 5 years, why are we even discussing whether he has to or not? For sure he has to. It must be that it was like this case, that he wrote it for her, but he never signed it, and therefore it's a clear proof from our Mishnah that he is obligated in a situation like that. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily what happened. It doesn't have to be that he wrote out a shtar that's mechayev. It could just be that they wrote an agreement, they wrote a tnaim when they got engaged, in which they specify who gets what for what, how much are you giving my daughter, how much am I giving your son, and then they did kiddushin, and that's the type of thing which has a kinyan ba'amir. That's a kind of thing which doesn't have to be signed. That's a worked out agreement, and therefore that is chal, even though it's not signed. However, that the beer is no bearing on the case of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, which is talking about creating an obligation or admitting to a loan.